happy to have here our speaker tonight. I was a bit nervous. I was telling Michael, just arrived from the airport, coming from Vancouver, but luckily he's here. So for people that don't know him, although I'm sure most of you know him, Michael is a professor at University of British Columbia, and he holds a Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law. And he's also the co-director of the Outer Space Institute. I didn't know that there was such an institute. Interesting. He has held positions at Oxford University, St. Andrews, Duke University, and has received the Donner Prize twice for his books, International Law and the Arctic, and Who Owns Outer Space. We're, as you know, Science for Peace is organizing all these presentations. We are a voluntary organization, and we hope that people will, the ones that haven't joined us, please do. I think the times that we are going through an organization that Science for Peace is very important and relevant. After Michael's presentations, we will have a time for questions. We also, this is a hybrid meeting, so there, in fact, most people are following this presentation on Zoom. And I think the floor is yours, Michael, then.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I have started my timer for 30 minutes because I want to have questions and comments and criticism and all the good stuff that comes from having people thinking together. This is my second time speaking at Science for Peace, and I still have fond memories of the first occasion. This is an important group. Thank you for all that you do. I'd also like to acknowledge that Metta Spence and Doug Roach are on Zoom. That's a great honor. They are real heroes of the peace movement in this country. So, hello Metta, hello Doug. I read in the Globe and Mail, as I was waiting for my plane in Vancouver, that Prime Minister Mark Carney has just created a new cabinet committee on security and sovereignty. So I spent the 4.5-hour flight thinking about what that committee might address. This might be a newspaper article of my own when I finished working this through. So this is all very fresh in my mind. But I want to give you a few initial thoughts as to what that committee should consider and why my view of what they consider is probably much broader than the view of the people who will actually be briefing it. So, when you think about security and sovereignty, many people will immediately think of Russians and Chinese planes and ships sailing towards Canada, perhaps invading the Canadian Arctic. They will also, in the current context, be thinking about the United States, and perhaps above all, the very intense pressure from the Trump administration for Canada to increase its defense spending to 2% or even 5%, depending on which day Donald Trump is speaking. So the conversation, I imagine, will be about new armed icebreakers, new fighter jets, that there will be a desire to put anti-ballistic missile capabilities onto Canada's new warships that are being built for us in Halifax, that there will be a scaling up of technology, of the modernization of our military equipment. There's even a commitment to buy new submarines. So that's the discussions I imagine it will start in this committee. It will be about military equipment, high-tech equipment costing hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, I think those are important discussions to have. I've done a lot of work on defense procurement over the years. I'm not actually a fully committed peacenik. But I do want to challenge that framing that I've heard over the last few months and that I expect we'll hear in the months ahead. So first of all, I don't think this conversation within the Security and Sovereignty Committee is going to be addressing climate change, which in the view of many experts is the predominant challenge to national security that we face right now. That might be dealt with by another committee, although it seems to me that the Carney government is going to downplay climate change in favor of developing Canada's natural resources. I don't think the committee is going to be addressing humanitarian crises in the global south. Even though humanitarian crises, often now driven by climate change, are generating mass migration, which many people view as a security challenge when the migrants reach our shores. And also, many people not thinking, not realizing that humanitarian crises are favorable recruiting grounds for terrorists and other bad actors, for organized crime. And we will see, I suspect, pressure to reduce Canada's overseas development assistance, much like the Keir Starmer government has recently done in the UK, taking money from development assistance and putting it into military spending, not realizing that that actually is likely to be disadvantageous to national security in the end. So I want to encourage people to think broadly about what security and sovereignty might mean in a realistic, holistic sense of things. I would like this committee to also grapple with the fact that the threats that are talked up by the Canadian military and this ecosystem of defense lobbyists and defense-funded think tanks might not be as serious or as overwhelming as is often portrayed. Let me switch here for a few minutes just to the Arctic. The Russian threat to the Canadian Arctic. Consider for a moment the fact that Russia is the largest country and uncontestably owns half of the Arctic. A very simple question. Why would Russia attack a NATO country in order to acquire more Arctic for itself? It's just an implausibility, a military invasion of the Canadian Arctic by Russia. There are many bad things that Russia could do in Canada. I'm thinking about cyber attacks, for instance, thinking about sabotage, subversion, but a military invasion by actual troops seems implausible. What about China? China has become a central actor in the integrated world economy. It has a huge hunger for natural resources, but it also depends on Western markets, international trade. And so how does China acquire natural resources in places like Africa and Latin America through foreign investment and trade. Sometimes with a great deal of pressure applied for favorable conditions. But China doesn't invade countries for resources. It has other ways of accessing them. And as a result, the idea that China is going to invade a NATO country in order to acquire resources that it can acquire in peaceful ways is also implausible. And let me remind you of two things here. There are Chinese-owned mines in the Canadian Arctic, operating with the full permission of the Canadian government. And if I look outside of my office window at the University of British Columbia, on any given day, I can see several dozen large cargo ships waiting to load up Canadian natural resources to take them to China. So that's a straw man of an argument to say that somehow we're facing a possible invasion by either Russia or China. So when we're talking about security and sovereignty in a place like the Canadian Arctic, well, again, cyber attacks, hacking, ransom attacks, corporate espionage, election interference. These are things that we know Russia and China engage in, and maybe that's where a big part of our focus in terms of security should go. Rather than buying more big, shiny, high-tech, billion-dollar toys for the military. If you ask the Canadian forces what the primary mission is in the Arctic, the actual operational Canadian forces, they will tell you that it is search and rescue. That the capacity to move a large helicopter quickly to rescue people from a sinking ship in the Northwest Passage is a primary mission. So too is rescuing an Inuit hunter or some tourists who got stranded on an ice floe. That's the primary mission. It's also the only, quote, no-fail mission in the Canadian Armed Forces. Search and rescue. So, apart from that, in the Canadian Arctic, apart from engaging in search and rescue, being able to provide disaster relief, to engage the Canadian Rangers, our reserve units in the north, which provide essential search and rescue and surveillance for hundreds of kilometers around Arctic communities. Apart from that, the only real Arctic mission are the radar sites, the North Warning System, which built on the old DEW line, the old distant early warning system, which exists to provide surveillance over the North Pole of incoming aircraft and missiles from Russia. And I actually support the upgrading of that radar capability. It's a major contribution to North American defense. It's a surveillance mission, and we need upgraded radar because they're growing old and because Russia is acquiring new technologies, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, that demand a technological response. But that's it. The idea of sending naval ships to the Arctic is, to my mind, ludicrous. The ships we send to the Arctic should be painted red and white and operated by the Canadian Coast Guard and able to fulfill dozens of different missions during the same voyage, breaking ice for commercial vessels, doing resupply for Arctic communities, supporting Arctic science. Those are not naval roles, those are Coast Guard roles. I was pleased to see in the Liberal platform the idea that we should provide the Canadian Coast Guard with some security functions. And I would go so far as to support putting a light deck gun on the front of the larger Coast Guard vessels to provide that quiet authority that sometimes is needed to stop a drug smuggler from running away. But it's not a military mission. And to the degree that there needs to be a police presence, it's a constabulary presence. It's dealing with organized crime. The discussion concerning the rest of Canada's security needs have focused recently on the planned purchase of F-35s. And I wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail a couple of months ago questioning whether the F-35s were a bad idea for a new reason. There were old reasons, which still are valid for not buying F-35s. But the new reason is the demonstrated unreliability of the current US government. In fact, any unreliable ally is not an ally. And we saw the US government in negotiations with Ukraine threatening to turn off coverage from SpaceX's Starlink satellite service. Just a couple of months ago. In other words, willing to turn off access to a militarily critical technology in order to secure negotiating advantage on something else. In the case of the United States, access to critical minerals in Ukraine. So it turns out that the F-35s, which are extremely, what's the word, computerized aircraft, require both computer updates and mission specific programs that are produced at 2 facilities in the United States. There's no kill switch on an F-35. You can still fly an F-35 without the updates from the United States. But the capacity of the F-35 to operate to its full functionality will become progressively limited. And so you will essentially have just a big, clunky F-16 rather than a highly computerized system of systems that is indeed the main purpose for the F-35. And so the prospect of a US government.
They're asking people here if you can come close to
to the microphone. The possibility that we could be buying a fighter jet that we would not be able to use to its full functionality at the whim of a US president is, to my mind, an absolute veto on proceeding with the purchase. And although this is a difficult pill for people to swallow, especially in the Canadian military, which has worked so hard to get these F-35s for almost 20 years now, it strikes me as necessary. Now, the good news is that there is an alternative aircraft readily available that was deemed acceptable at the end of a competition that was held by the Canadian government just a few years ago. And this is a Swedish plane, the Saab Gripen E. So if we felt that we needed new fighter jets, there is an acceptable plan that cannot be turned off by Donald Trump. So I'd like to see that procurement reopened and the F-35 ruled unacceptable, which leads to one result. But the other thing I want to suggest at this point too is, and here I'm going to agree with Elon Musk for the first time in several years, is that the age of the crewed fighter jet, piloted fighter jet, is just about over. We have seen advancements in the use of drones in Ukraine that were difficult to imagine just a year or two ago. Not just in the air, but also at sea. The Ukrainian military has opened up the Black Sea to commercial traffic using essentially Zodiacs with outboard motors on them, an optical unit on the front, most of them made in Hamilton by a company called Westcam, a Starlink satellite terminal, thank you Elon Musk, and 350 kilograms of high explosives. And they go hunting Russian warships with a unit that only costs $20,000. And they've been highly effective in doing this. Now, I'm not a supporter of countries blowing up each other's ships normally, but I give you this example simply to point out that that legacy sort of systems, piloted fighter jets, billion-dollar warships, might be somewhat time limited. And in the case of the fighter jets, perhaps to go for a fourth generation fighter jet like the Saab Gripen for the next 10 years as a transition to whatever comes next, rather than putting all of our marbles into a hyper expensive, very high-tech aircraft that could be limited at the whim of Donald Trump or another US president. These are the sorts of discussions I hope this committee is having, this security and sovereignty committee. But I also want to, in the 10 minutes I have left, suggest that there are a few things that could be done that might please a lot of people in this room and online. First of all, the most glaring inadequacy in the Canadian Armed Forces concerns recruitment and retention. We are many thousands of people short of the force numerical goals of successive Canadian governments. People don't want to join the Canadian forces anymore, especially those people who have high degrees of training in operating advanced computer systems and aircraft. Now, if you were to increase the size of the Canadian forces, what kind of forces would we want to have? Well, I would have a readily deployable contingent, large contingent, of infantry and trucks and light armor vehicles that could do disaster relief, peacekeeping, and provide a deterrent function like Canadian troops are providing in Latvia today. In terms of a bang for our buck, having 10 or 20,000 young Canadians, yes, with rifles, but able to go and help prevent wars, or maintain peace, or provide a deterrence function, or ensure that humanitarian aid gets where it needs to get after an earthquake. We got out of UN peacekeeping 25, almost 30 years ago, and we've been badly missed. Imagine a Canadian Prime Minister saying that Canada's commitment to help stop the fighting in Gaza is to offer 5,000 Canadian peacekeepers. What if Canada made a similar commitment in Ukraine? What if we had the ability to make that promise? When we talk about Canada as having lost its stature, its influence on the world stage for a relatively small amount of money, for the cost of perhaps a fleet of F-35s, we could be back big time in a low-tech, mostly peaceful way. And then all of those new soldiers would also be available for domestic missions. Because we're in a climate crisis. Disaster relief is going to be a massive requirement for the Canadian forces in the decades ahead. Forest firefighting, dealing with the aftermath of floods. And then, when we get the next pandemic, being able to go into the old age homes to help save lives. You think about what the Canadian forces have been asked to do in the last 5 or 10 years. They've been overstretched in their ability to do some really important things. So I hope the conversation isn't just about, are we going to get stealth fighter jets? Are we going to get missile defense capable warships? It'd be nice if it was also about, how do we build up our force level and do things with these new personnel that could help out at home and rebuild Canada's stature abroad. I don't think that's going to be part of the conversation, but I sure wish that it would. And I'm going to close by saying that we have to stop thinking about security as just a military thing. I've already mentioned the importance of overseas development assistance, but I'd also like to mention the essential role of diplomacy. We used to have best foreign service in the world. We still have many extraordinary people. I'm not talking down on our current diplomats, but there are not enough of them, and they are not well supported enough to have the maximum positive impact that you would want the Canadian Foreign Service to have. Because this new government's going to be looking for ways to trim budgets, to redistribute finances. And they're going to look at departments like Global Affairs Canada and say, well, how many embassies can we close? Right? Can we rely on local personnel rather than professional Canadian Foreign Service officers? They're going to forget that if you can prevent a war, you save massively on the amount you need to spend on the military. That a diplomat, pound for pound, kilogram for kilogram, is probably the best investment you can make in terms of national security. So that's just a brief oversight of some ideas as to how I think this new cabinet committee on security and sovereignty might start to think. That maybe security needs to be holistic, and maybe the threats to our sovereignty aren't as great as we thought they were, or they come in different forms. They don't involve invasions of foreign militaries, but they come through the internet, or they come through the infiltration of diasporas by bad actors, or they come through organized crime. Right? That would be a shift that would greatly annoy the senior leadership of the Canadian forces, the defense lobby, the defense think tanks, and a heck of a lot of journalists in this country. Because we got into this different mindset. So I'm not a peacemaker in the sense that I do believe we need militaries. But I think we can take this conversation about the future of the Canadian military and expand it in useful ways that serve a broader array of functions and can help make for a better world. 27 minutes. Okay, I would love to get input on this, because as I said, this is just a preliminary take on a really big set of issues. Thank you. I can take my own question.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just mention, because there's people at Zoom that may want to ask questions too. So I would ask people that want to ask questions on Zoom to raise their hands, use the symbol going down the screen. You can see React, and in the React you can find the raise hand. And if you use that, Melissa will unmute you, and I will call her to mute you, and then you can ask the question, okay? And obviously here, I think our sound is not very good, so maybe, Michael, you may want to repeat the question.
I can do that.
So, yeah.
Okay, fine. And I will try to speak right into the microphone.
Yeah, I see.
I'm trying to cancel this so we can see the participant.
Valentin, Melissa, can you unmute Valentin?
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. If you can't hear me very well, I put my question in the chat. I was saying you've spoken about this moment of crisis and opportunity. You spoke about this committee that I was Googling and looking up while you were talking. And my question is, in the digital space, the crisis playing out through disinformation, manipulation, propaganda, foreign influence campaigns, from your perspective, what are the most realistic short-term steps Canada can take to strengthen digital sovereignty and protect democratic integrity? Should Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Culture and Identity, be part of that Security and Sovereignty Committee, given the rapid growth of digital threats to our security?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yes, the most immediate thing that the current government could do would be to tell Meta that they cannot operate in Canada unless they remove the restriction on the posting of Canadian news stories on Facebook and Instagram. I don't know how much distortion that caused during this most recent election, but I know it caused a lot. When Canada Proud is the most visible source of information on Facebook and Instagram for millions of Canadians looking for information, then something is seriously wrong. Australia stood up to that. Canada has not effectively stood up. They do not want to allow Canadian media to be shared. They should just be kept out. There are other things that could be done, and I would just say that I actually regard Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk as serious national security concerns for Canada. What Musk has done in some other countries, like Germany, if it's not illegal, it should be. And so a new Canadian government has a mandate to stand up for Canadian sovereignty and independence, has to include these mega corporations, big tech, in its understanding of where the threats come. Hope that answers your question. Yes, please.
Michael, in your survey of security issues and how we should respond to them, you said very little about threat from the United States. Yet Trump obviously has talked about annexation on many occasions and has not ruled out use of force in Syria and Congo. So I'm wondering, do you not feel that the U.S. does pose a security threat to Canada? And if it does, how should we respond?
After the Prime Minister's recent visit to the White House, I have the sense that the President now realizes that Canada is not listening. So I think the threat of a coercive annexation is probably not worth worrying about. And in any event, if the U.S. military was sent to invade Canada, there's very little we could do, just to be realistic. But I don't think it's worth worried about. But I do worry about interference in Canada by the U.S. government, in much the same way that Russia and China interfere in our country, right? Through the internet, through espionage and subversion, through economic levers, through threatening to turn off starving Arctic communities. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to be thinking about the United States as a source of those kinds of things, not military invasion, but seeking to make Canadians willing to make concessions, avoid certain policies. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I now worry about the possibility that we may end up negotiating the release of Canadian citizens and permanent residents detained in the United States. And that doesn't sound too far from the situation we had with China a few years ago with the two migrants. That's the sort of stuff. But on the positive side, Donald Trump is the best thing that's happened to Canadian unity in decades. I haven't, this is my first time in Toronto in 6 months, so I don't know what the feeling is here, but where I live, the Canadian flags. And it's not the convoy that's putting up the flags anymore. It's ordinary Canadians. There's a sense of pride and optimism and resolve in the face of Donald Trump and his statements and actions. So yeah, I'm actually, the United States is going to give us a really rough ride. But we're going to get through it, because Canada is united. All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to ask a follow-up question to the previous question. I was just wondering, going back to the point of the United States, whether it's just whether the overall outcome is an anomaly is true in 4 years, or are we looking at some sort of more systematic trend that might be have to deal with for, let's say, the next 1 to 2 decades or even longer, and that practice on diplomacy, whether there's anything we can do about regarding using diplomacy to prepare for, to some extent, to see what we can do with the alliance, or if the U.S. is still seen as a reliable alliance.
I mean, it's impossible. But yes, this could last for longer than 4 years. Trump is already grooming a couple of potential successors, and elections in the United States are less free and fair than they used to be. So yes, I think that our strategy should include building a stronger Canada. It's a no regret policy, right? If the United States returns to being a friendly, democratic partner, great. But we'll have a more united country with a return to UN peacekeeping, and we'll get rid of the interprovincial trade barriers and all kinds of stuff, right? So yeah, let's make the changes that make sense for the long term, regardless of what happens in the United States. I don't see it as it's unfortunate. It's massively, and yet I tell myself that we've got through some pretty bad stuff before, right? I'm old enough to have known a lot of people who fought in the Second World War. My mother almost starved to death in what was the immediate post-war West Germany. So this is fine. I mean, we've just had it easy for a few days.
Jadi saya akan mengambil data.
You're muted.
Okay, Meta.
Hi, Michael. You mentioned security in the sense of making sure that you become economically vulnerable. I forgot what connection you made that point, but I can think of a couple, and I wonder if you would go so far. I mean, you really envision something quite radical. You're talking about maybe having to rescue hostages from the U.S. Canadians. That's a very, very dim view of the future. But I'm thinking of a couple of things like sale of Canadian oil to the U.S. or the transport of it through the U.S. to Florida, to Louisiana, and sale it off. Apparently, pretty soon we'll be able to sell it to the world from Vancouver, which, as a climate activist, I deplore, but I could see why that might make a difference in terms of being able to withhold energy from the U.S. But there's another case that I think is more interesting right now that Gordon Edwards has called my attention to, which is that Ontario is buying 4 small modular reactors from the U.S. that are U.S. designed or U.S. produced that will become dependent on enriched uranium through the U.S. Now, that makes Ontario's entire energy, electricity system vulnerable to being shut off if Trump wants to really play hardball. You just shut off the uranium and end of story. I wonder, would you go so far as to say that Canada should be really refusing, such things as that, or is that too dim a view of the future?
Thank you for the question. Let me be clear. I wasn't proposing that we would engage in rescues of Canadian citizens detained in the United States, in the sense that I'm not envisaging extraction operations. But there are increasingly people detained in the United States who have every right to be there legally. And there indeed have been a couple of Canadians. And the U.S. government has not used that as a point of leverage for negotiation, but it's a small step forward. So let's keep all our consular officers with us, right? That would be really foolish to reduce the number of consular officers in the United States. We might need them. We also need to think hard about the Safe Third Country Agreement. I don't think that the United States is a safe third country anymore for Geneva Convention refugees. And I think we think really hard about our openness to people leaving the United States because they have become persecuted. I'm thinking first and foremost here of trans people. I think the Canadian government could show a lot of moral leadership by saying that any trans person in the United States who wants to migrate to Canada will be given access to do so. Because it's a life-threatening situation for many of them now. And it's federal government policy. We'll see what happens. Women being denied access to reproductive health care. That could be the next big thing in terms of Canada's refugee system. But coming back to your question, Madam, there will be many cases where we are vulnerable to the United States using its levers against us. But we have very many levers against them. And I think we should keep most of those levers untouched at the moment while letting the Americans know that we have them. So, coal shipments through the Port of Vancouver. U.S. coal through the Port of Vancouver. That's interesting. There's a lot of hydroelectricity that goes from Quebec and Ontario down into the United States. They know about that. It's interesting. It's a lot of Canadian aluminum that goes to the United States. And 80% of the potash used to fertilize crops in the American Midwest comes from Saskatchewan. And I could go on. I could give you literally dozens and dozens of other examples of U.S. dependence on Canada. Now, I think we want to approach this in a mature, measured way. If they are talking about hitting us with some kind of economic constraint, like more tariffs, we should remind them that we will retaliate. And we should retaliate in a targeted manner. impose maximum pain on vulnerable industry. So yeah, closing down the sales of Kentucky bourbon in the United States, that hurt. Right? In the United States, in Kentucky. And those farmers in the American Midwest who need to use fertilizer that arrives just in time from Saskatchewan, they're certainly expressing their views to the White House. Right? It's a different kind of negotiation. It's not a free negotiation anymore. But the United States knows that we have a lot of levers, a lot of cards. And so I'm not that good. We need to be aware of our vulnerabilities. We need to try to close off the vulnerabilities when it makes sense to do so. But at the same time, on a very targeted instance-by-instance basis, not pushing back, posing a little bit of economic pain on the United States. That's the way to get through this relationship. And I think Mr. Carney is with me on this. We're not going to threaten the United States, but we're not going to ignore the complications.
I agree with your the thrust of your analysis in a lot of the details. You know, we're living through a historical accident. We should never have happened. Right? Mr. Biden had done what he said he was going to do, you know, arrested. And so this could be a historical accident. We all have a stake in helping the system self-correct. We happen, most of the people in this room happen to be agreeing with 64% of Americans who are basically on the same side, right, at this point in time. But, you know, go back to your point about, you know, what it means for us here. In some ways, it's really a good thing that we Canadians today are now being forced to think about the new 1867. Like, what kind of country do we want? And what kind of country are we willing to pay for? Right? How are we going to keep the next generation of young people here, for example, when they still can go south of the border, and when most of the threats have nothing to do with borders and old-fashioned security, the way that Mike was talking about here. Now, in that regard, the question to you is just to focus this in a little bit. The way I'm trying to do it is think about our late great colleague, Peter Russell. Not a little over a year ago. And, you know, late in his life, after he retired, ostensibly retired, he wrote a book called Sovereignty. And it was called The Biography of the Flame, but what he meant was sovereignty, an idea is irrelevant. Doesn't, to the extent that it means self-reliance, it is a vacuous concept. Well, even to the extent it means really strict legal sovereignty. The way Steve Bannon is telling Mr. Trump. Bannon was interviewed last week by a serious journalist from NPR, CNN, and he the journalist pressed him and said, "What is your vision of the future?" He said, "My vision is 1648. We need to go back to Westphalia, where everybody's inside their really seriously demarcated boundaries, and everybody takes care of their own business. And outside, it's all about balance of power, et cetera, et cetera." What? That's crazy. Now, Peter wrote two other books. The one that was mentioned by is the priest at his funeral over at St. Thomas. The priest didn't, obviously, he knew Peter, but he didn't really read the book. Because he said Peter Russell's last book wasn't his last book. Peter Russell's book was Canada's Odyssey, country based on incomplete conquests. The priest said, "You see, he left something for the next generation to finish the job." No, he didn't. Since 1867, and even really from the time of the American Revolution, the idea was compromise, semi-sovereignty. French can have their own nation inside this one state. The Anglos can have their own nation. Now, either the indigenous peoples can have their own nation, without the flag waving that came up, that was a very receptive comment that just came on online. The idea of, yes, you have your own nation, your own community, but it's going to be deeply involved, interdependent with the others. And there's no clear boundaries around that. That we thought we were in the world before the Trump mistake, where we were all moving toward kind of a Canada. What people are saying now, what should we do? Maybe we should join the European Union. That's the idea, kind of larger federation. Let's get back to the program. And my question, though, is, did a generation of Canadians forget, almost take it for granted, this would happen automatically without any sacrifice? When Pierre Trudeau said, look, Europeans can take care of themselves, we can bring our troops home. Americans did not do that. And those 50,000 troops are still necessary in Europe. And they're actually thinking of doing what Pierre Trudeau thought, or said to do. And also, the basic idea that we're in a nuclear era. We can't go back to a Westphalian world because there will be an accident at the very least. We have to deal with these things together. So how do we do, did Canada lose its grant before the Trump era? Or is the Trump era now bringing us back to say, the Americans can't do this alone, but we also can't do it without them?
So there's a lot in there. One's conception of sovereignty depends on where one is located. I think Ukrainians have a certain sense of sovereignty, and that their country has been invaded, and they're fighting to
agree with your the thrust of your analysis and a lot of the details. But, we're living through a historical accident. This should never have happened. Mr. Biden had done what he said he was going to do. The rest of it. So this could be a historical accident. We all have a stake in helping the system self-correct. Most people in this room happen to be agreeing with 64% of Americans who are basically on the same side, right? At this point in time. But, go back to your point about what it means for us here. In some ways, it's really a good thing that we Canadians today are now being forced to think about the new 1867. Like, what kind of country do we want? And what kind of country are we willing to pay for? Right? How are we going to keep the next generation of young people here, for example, when they still can go south of the border, and when most of the threats nothing to do with borders and old-fashioned security, the way that Mike was talking about here. Now, in that regard, the question to you is just to focus this in. The way I'm trying to do it is think about our late great colleague, Peter Russell. Not a little over a year ago. And, late in his life, after he retired, ostensibly retired, he wrote a book called Sovereignty. And it was called Biography of the Flame, but what he meant was sovereignty, an idea is irrelevant. Doesn't, to the extent that it means self-reliance, it is a vacuous concept. Even to the extent it means really strict legal sovereignty. The way Steve Bannon is telling Mr. Trump. Bannon was interviewed last week by a serious journalist from NPR, CNN, and the journalist pressed him and said, "What is your vision of the future?" He said, "My vision is 1648. We need to go back to Westphalia, where everybody's inside their really seriously demarcated boundaries, and everybody takes care of their own business. And outside, it's all about balance of power, et cetera, et cetera." What? That's crazy. Now, Peter wrote two other books. The one that was mentioned by is the priest at his funeral over at St. Thomas. Priest didn't, obviously, he knew Peter, but he didn't really read the book. Because he said Peter Russell's last book, Peter Russell's book was Canada's Odyssey, country based on incomplete conquests. The priest said, "See, he left something for the next generation to finish the job." No, we didn't. No, we didn't. Since 1867, and even really from the time of the American Revolution, the idea was compromise, semi-sovereignty. French can have their own nation inside this one state. The Anglos can have their own nation. Now, the indigenous peoples can have their own nation without the flag waving that came up. That was a very receptive comment that just came on my mind. The idea, yes, you have your own nation, your own community, but it's going to be deeply involved, interdependent with the others. There's no clear boundaries around that. That we thought we were in the world before the Trump stick, where we were all moving toward kind of a Canada. What people are saying now, what should we do? Maybe we should join the European Union. That's the idea, kind of larger federation. Let's get back to the program. And my question, though, is, did a generation of Canadians forget, almost take it for granted, this would happen automatically without any sacrifice? When Pierre Trudeau said, look, Europeans can take care of themselves, we'll bring our troops home. Americans did not do that. And those 50,000 troops are still necessary in Europe. They're actually thinking of doing what Pierre Trudeau thought, or secondly. And also, the basic idea that we're in a nuclear era. We can't go back to a Westphalian world because there will be an accident at the very least. We have to deal with these threats together. So how do we do, did Canada lose the threat before the Trump era? Or is the Trump era now bringing us back to say, the Americans can't do this alone, but we also can't do it without them?
So there's a lot in there. One's conception of sovereignty depends on where one is located. I think Ukrainians have a certain sense of sovereignty, and that their country has been invaded, and they're fighting to hold off the question that would take away their sovereignty. In Canada, when we talk about sovereignty, we usually are thinking, at least many of us, about the Northwest Passage. And most people don't understand. The United States accepts Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, which just argues that there's a right amount of passage through Canadian internal waters, Canadian territorial waters. So even our sovereignty is not sovereignty. It's about certain sovereign rights being different in a certain place. But in a sort of postmodern, post-Cold War world, I think we actually did pretty well. And I'm glad you mentioned Indigenous peoples, because that's one place where we still have a huge amount of work to do. But my classes at UBC are the most amazing Canadian mosaic. Because Vancouver, like Toronto, is a major city of immigration. And then we have international students still on top of all that. And so the world is my classroom. The university is the world. And, these young people from immigrant families are just as proudly Canadian as any of the rest of us. And they make us stronger. They also increasingly help us diverge from the United States. Right? I wrote a book a few years ago entitled Intent for a Nation. So I looked at a lot of the social science concerning Canadian versus American values. And what was happening then, and I think it's happening faster now, is that we are moving towards the United States, or we have been. The United States has been moving away from us faster than we've been moving towards it. Right? So yeah, we're changing as a country, evolving for better or worse. I think for better. And to the degree we've fallen short, it's not the fault of the Canadian people, it's the fault of our governments who have lacked any serious ambition to use Canada's incredible potential influence on the world stage. We're a G7 country. Right? We have the second largest piece of real estate on the planet. We're actually not hated by anyone else. That's remarkable. Like, not hated. Okay, I'm not talking about being friends. We have the capacity to do really extraordinary things. We have some of the best universities in the world. We avoided the demographic deficit that countries like Japan have faced through our very open immigration policies. We've done a lot of things right, but that failure to use our influence for good, not to be moralistic with regards to other countries, we do too much of that, but to actually say, okay, yeah, we have 10,000 troops ready to go. We just had a massive earthquake, you'll be there tomorrow. And it just so happens that we can get them there tomorrow because one of the good things that Stephen Harper did was to buy in 5 C-17 Worldmasters. Our capacity to put troops and light vehicles anywhere in the world within 48 hours is unmatched by any country of comparable population. Right? So, yeah, what could we do? What could a county government do if they shared my vision? I think it's quite exciting. But they'll be talked into caution by the generals and the accountants that will descend upon them. Well, actually, probably already have. Okay, lots of hands, lots of questions. We go to you first. Yes.
You've spoken a lot about external threats to the sovereignty. What about the threats from within? Specifically, unfortunately, they tend to dominate the airwaves a lot more, separatist movements, both in Quebec and Alberta now as well.
Andrew Coyne has a brilliant piece in today's corporate now, where he points out just how silly this all is. Even the people who are supposedly leading the separatist movement want to keep their Canadian passports in the Canadian military, right? They want to keep their Canadian pension plans and payments, right? It's not serious. I'm Albertan in that my parents have lived there for the last 45 years. I went to high school there, and I was there just last week. And if most Albertans actually had an understanding of what full separation would do to them and their economic future, they would reject it in a heartbeat, right? And don't think that they're going to get free transportation for their oil to the coast of BC, right? I mean, it's ludicrous. Yeah, the media likes to focus on it, and Facebook and Instagram, because there's no real news there, tend to amplify all this misinformation. But no. And one of the things I hope is that Mr. Carney will just shut this down, right? And say, well, yeah, you want to have a referendum, let's make it about real separation. Okay? And here are the consequences of real separation. Yeah, let's have that referendum. Let's get like 70% of Albertans saying, no way. Just close that door.
Follow-up is there's a reason why Pierre lost the election. Right? And you can say whatever, there's a lot of theories why, but one of the many theories that is the communist Russia, which is quite nice, especially when you are in this country, and what's happening in the US as well. It's just a little overpowering. So what would you say to half the country that still supports that kind of rhetoric and that kind of media?
Michael, maybe you can repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is about Pierre Poilievre and how his divisive. Sorry, I wanted to slip into an English accent there. My wife is English, so I'm bilingual. A divisive rhetoric what that has done in terms of the future of Canada, because many people were overwhelmed by it and became to some degree accepting of it. Look, I'm not a student of the far right and far right rhetoric, but I do recognize that every government in this country eventually runs out of steam. The Liberal Party had run out of steam under Justin Trudeau. They got really lucky, right? With Donald Trump and then Mark Carney, and they only just scraped, right? It was really close. So if I had the ear of the new Prime Minister, I would say, that'd be a really good time to go back to that pledge that Justin Trudeau made over 2,000 times and make this most recent election the last election under first past the post in Canada, because that's how you keep the right power. I doubt that will happen, but I think there would be an appetite, and I really at this point don't care whether it's the right ballot or proportional representation. Let's just have something that keeps the right wing from gaining power in this country, because they will tear us apart. The last thing I will find an almost double miracle in the last 6 months. 2 Green MLAs in British Columbia held off a almost extreme right-wing government coming to power. And then 7 New Democrats have the balance of power in Ottawa. People aren't talking about this. Mr. Carney needs a dance partner. And I actually think that when you get either coalitions or spotting confidence motions or some kind of working relationship, that part of the reason that sometimes we have good things happen in this country and have moderate governments is because time to time we have minority situations. I would just love to have every government in Canada for the future be a minority government. Right? It would be so much better for all of us. Again, I'm doubtful that Prime Minister Carney will. He's got a lot on his plate. Electoral reform might be an task too far.
I appreciated how you framed your talk about this security and sovereignty cabinet or subcommittee of cabinet. You kind of talked about, they probably won't listen to what you were suggesting to us tonight. But my mind always goes to who are the people within cabinet or caucus who are pushable or persuadable. We know there probably aren't a lot, but who would you say would be people who would be realistic and holistic, right? You're talking about people who can have.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that. Part of the reason I haven't thought about it is that, for the most part, cabinet ministers haven't mattered much over the last few governments. Hopefully that will change. I'd like to actually see cabinet government for a change. And there are some capable people in this new cabinet. So we'll see. And I do spend time talking to people in Ottawa. Full disclosure, I'm currently benefiting from a Department of National Defense grant on space security. Right? I talk to the troops, the same ones I was criticized earlier this evening. I do talk to them. Sometimes they listen to me. But what I would like to understand is that what happens in the public square, not just on social media, what happens in the public square, what happens when we can create national conversations about political issues, what happens when we have activism campaigns, when you have groups like science. So I hope Doug Roach is still on the call. And Meta Spencer, yes, Doug is there. Meta Spencer is there. 21 years ago, people like Meta, Doug, and myself, a guy named Steve Staples, we took on the proposal for Canada to join U.S. missile defense. And everyone said, oh, crazy. You'll never be able to stop this. The Americans want Canada, and this is a really big deal. You're just like, You're talking into the face of a hurricane, guaranteed losing campaign. We stopped it. And I can give you other examples of successful campaigns in Canada that start as grassroots campaigns and become animated and activated and spread and eventually change the direction of actual national decision making. So someone here said, I'll never be able to stop the purchase of the F-35 in conversation before the session. So the general will talk there. This is a national decision, right? Yeah, they've gone through the whole career wanting full interoperability with the United States. I understand that's the way they think. They've been conditioned to think that. I'm not trying to change the mind of the generals. I'm trying to change the mind of the government. How do you change the government? You activate public opinion. So yeah, if people don't like the idea that F-35 is subject to U.S. computer systems, well, let's just keep repeating that, saying it's unacceptable. And who knows? Even that, all this stuff. One of my mentors, who's a legal philosopher at the University of Cambridge named Bullet Pallet, has a very, very important message for young people, which is that everything that you study, everything you live within for the most part, all these social and legal structures, are creations of human will. And that means they can be changed. Right? There are certain things, physical laws you can't change, right? But all of the structures, all of the decisions, all of these policies, with the right amount of pressure, the right place at the right time, you can change it. Okay, I don't know if there's anything else, or I might be very happy to stop there with that.
I think it should be on that too.
And I'll hang around after. You can ask me my question later. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael, for a very stimulating talk and all the answers that you provide us. I think I keep the last one answer that you gave us, that people want to make changes and stop the F-35 or other things that come across our organization, and I think that's another reason why we think that it's important for people to join groups like Science for Peace. And I invite you to thank you for attending this event, and to attend future events. Just follow us in the website, scienceforpeace.org, where you can have all the information regarding future events. And I think.
Actually, I'll put a piece of paper right there and people can sign it and email.
Okay, thank you very much. Things are changing so much.